Thanks for everyone for hanging out with us today. Really appreciate it. Next up, we have Mark Doberstein. We're going to be diving into securing teams with Microsoft 365 security for remote work. And go ahead and take it off. Take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Joel. So now that it's after lunch, we're going to, again, talk about securing teams with Microsoft 365 security services for remote work. And so really, when we start thinking about security in Office 365 and Teams, that's kind of a foundational point of securing the services, because without securing services, you're not going to have a service, right? So just to go, whoops, let's make sure this is going forward. This is our agenda for this session. We're going to talk a little introduction about security for Office 365, some talking about zero trust model. I'm sure some of you have heard about zero trust, others may not have heard about zero trust. We're going to look at a plan that Microsoft's put out for basically making Microsoft 365 services using zero trust model, and also securing other cloud services with some of the Microsoft 365 security services. Security capabilities and licensing. So we'll talk about what's available depending on what license you have. And then we'll actually dive into the 12 steps to secure Office 365 for remote work. And at the end, we'll have a little bit of Q&A. So the first part, really talking about the introduction of security with Teams and Office 365. A lot of customers are kind of still in that old model of using a trusted network to get to Office 365. That's really kind of an antiquated model, something not to really look forward to in the future. And especially now that we're required to do remote work, there's spread of shadow IT and a lot of cybercrime. As you see, there's been a lot of things in the news about, more phishing attempts with COVID-19 and things like that. You really have to start looking at securing the actual services and the applications and everything that goes along with that. And so looking at enhanced security services will help you look at containing your cloud and SaaS application sprawl, looking at shadow IT, and basically remediating things like obsolete network security models. So that's where zero trust comes in. So that this security model has been out there. The framework's been out there for a little while. The phrase was coined by Forrester back in 2010. But what this really means is shifting away from that trusted network model. Corporate trusted networks are what a lot of security teams have, right? The corporate trusted model means that you trust everything in your network and you port everything through your trusted network to get out to your services, including cloud services. A lot of customers still do that. And so basically what zero trust means is you're shifting away from that trusted security model, that trusted network. You want to verify at the actual access of applications. And what that means is if you look to the right, we look at this diagram and we look at what are the pieces that actually are the building blocks to accessing your applications. It's looking at the actual application or workload, looking at the network connection to that workload, looking at devices, and looking at people or your identity, and also protecting the data that resides in the service. So if you look at the circles around that, you look at visibility and analytics, meaning knowing what's happening in your environment and against all these different components in your service access, and then automating and orchestrating responses to any kind of threat into those workloads and those different pillars. So really it's getting and making sure that you don't trust anything but verify all the time. So you're not trusting that anything coming from your trusted network is trusted by the service. So a lot of customers still do that VPN model where they're forcing everybody to come VPN into their trusted network and then come back out through firewalls and proxies back out to Office 365. This is getting rid of that kind of model and verifying and protecting all of your applications and data from directly to the service. So instead of worrying about your trusted network. So Microsoft put out this plan. It's a path to zero trust and secure cloud services. Microsoft identified 12 kind of key tasks to help security teams implement this kind of zero trust model. And these are the 12 steps. We'll talk about Azure multi-factor authentication, which is a very base building block of protecting your identity as you connect to your Office 365 services. We'll talk about enrolling devices, things like Intune for mobile app protection, enrolling PCs for device management and compliance, so that you're trusting the devices that are connecting to your services in the cloud into Office 365. You'll also talk a little bit about training. We talked about this earlier with ACM and adoption change management. And then we'll talk about monitoring for threats and taking action. So we want to talk a little bit about the capabilities that Microsoft puts out there, right? We have these different tasks that Microsoft kind of prescribed, right, to protect your Office 365 service. We want to talk about the licensing that's associated with that. So really, there's three kind of large scale plans that Microsoft has out there, and different customers have different plans, right? So if we took out and talk about the first column here, we talk about all Office 365 plans. So those would be standard E1, E3, E5, F1 plans. So there's certain tasks that you can execute based upon having that license plan. Then if you move up to Microsoft 365 E3 plan, which is so the Microsoft 365 plans include what's called Enterprise Mobility and Security Suites. And what that does is add on additional capabilities for things like identity, endpoint management, Intune to manage mobile devices, things like that, Azure Active Directory, premium licensing so that you can do identity protection in the cloud. So Microsoft 365 includes the licensing for the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite. So E3 has certain licensing pieces, and then as you move up to Microsoft 365 E5, which is that last column, you have all of the security services that Microsoft provides. And if you notice, numbers 3, 4, and 5, which are those advanced threat protection, that's using the capabilities of Microsoft's cloud service. So when you start looking at using machine learning and artificial intelligence to secure and provide threat detectors against things that are happening within your Office 365 infrastructure, those are what those pieces are. So when you start looking at E5, that's really those really advanced services that provide advanced threat protection. When the first task you really have to think about from a base level security standpoint, I think most customers have learned this, that identity is your base building block of protecting all of your services in Office 365, right? When you really think about the base building block, how do you get to your service in Office 365? It's using an identity. So instead of shifting, so you're looking at shifting that security baseline from your network being the protection border to things like your identity and service protection being that border. So one of the main building blocks or base building blocks for protecting your identity. So say people are, like I said, in this world, we're getting people's credentials compromised through like phishing attacks. So how do you protect those users that have been, their credentials have been harvested? You have to give another factor, right? You have to be able to protect those credentials, even though they may have been compromised. The bad actors won't have that second factor, right? So the base building block here is enabling that multi-factor authentication. And as you see here, even without Office, without the Azure Active Directory Premium P1 or P2 licensing, you can still enable Azure AD MFA. So Azure Active Directory MFA, you can enable through what's called security defaults if you have a standard Office 365 plan. So that's something that Microsoft has recently changed towards the beginning of the year and end of last year is called security defaults, and they rolled this out. So you can basically implement Azure MFA even if you don't have the premium licensing. For those companies that have Microsoft 365 E3, Premium One plan, Azure Active Directory Premium One is included that with that, you can enable Azure MFA and granularly against your user environment. So you can require MFA for administrators, which is a minimum, but you really want to start looking at requiring MFA for all users, right, to really protect their identities. The other part here is blocking legacy authentication, because legacy authentication means just username and password without MFA. So there are building blocks within the service to basically block those legacy authentications and only allow an identity to be able to authorize into your service with that additional multi-factor. And it's from a user experience standpoint, a lot of customers I've worked with Azure MFA will go like, well, I don't want to add another, point that they have to do or another user experience impact. But the thing about MFA for Azure is that you don't get that thing where people have to MFA every time they log in. When you get a token from the service, it's when you get that login initially that you're going to get an MFA prompt. After that, you shouldn't really get MFA prompts on a regular basis. It's going to be every once in a while for each of your users. But what you're doing is when you enable that multi-factor against your user base, you're really protecting against the bad actors from coming in and being able to connect as your users. So, kind of redirecting that paradigm that you're not enabling MFA to make the user experience worse, you're enabling it to protect from those bad actors or external threats that will have harvested credentials or your username and password for users. So thinking about it in that manner. The second step in Office 365 is really thinking about readjusting those threats against your email service. So I know this isn't specific to Teams, but it's one of the steps to protect the service in general, which ultimately Teams is one of the main components of the Office 365 service. But what this really does is when you look at Exchange Online Protection, that's a default service that comes with Office 365 to protect your email, right? So anti-malware, anti-phishing, and anti-spam protection. A lot of customers implement this and then leave the defaults. You really have to go look at these, Exchange Online Protection policies and really change them from defaults so that they're protecting your environment. I know a lot of customers will already have maybe another email protection service like Proofpoint or Ironport or things like that. But this is additionally understanding what's provided by the service versus what you may already be used to. And if you're looking at adjusting, you can maybe get rid of the other email hygiene protection service. So really thinking about what you can adjust from the defaults that really help protect your environment from an email service level. Then third, we look at what's called Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. And this is an E5 only service. What I mentioned in that licensing table is that certain services are only coming with that E5 benefit, or if you add on licensing for this with the EMS E5 package. So remember that Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite. So Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection includes what some of those advanced email hygiene services do, plus additional. So when you look at this, you look at things like safe links and safe attachments. What that means is that, so safe links are URLs that are known to be malicious. Microsoft does real-time scanning. And so when someone clicks on a link that maybe have been sent through email, and also what may be posted in Teams. So those URLs that are posted in Teams, it will do a real-time scan for malicious content and provide a safe link. So if there is malicious content on the end of that URL, when your user clicks on it, it will block them from accessing that URL. So that's safe links. And then again, safe attachments are what are known in the email world as attachment detonation. And what that means is that when an email comes through and it has an attachment, it scans that email by putting it in a virtual environment opening up that that attachment and seeing if there's malicious content. If there is, then it won't let that attachment through, and you'll get a a message in your email to your user saying that this attachment had malicious content. So really thinking about that, and putting those advanced protections into the service. Fourth, lots of customers, enterprise customers, are going to have Active Directory integrated with their identity path. What that means is they have a hybrid identity infrastructure. Most large customers will have Active Directory, and they'll be synchronizing that data to Office 365. So your users and passwords and groups and things like that will be synchronizing from your on-premise Active Directory up to Azure Active Directory, which backends Office 365. What Azure Advanced Threat Protection is that provides protection for that on-prem Active Directory. So it's basically agents called sensors that are put onto your domain controllers or to the additional servers that are port mirrored to your domain controllers. So it sends that data up to Azure, and Azure uses artificial intelligence and, again, machine learning to understand threats that may be being used to attack your on-premise Active Directory infrastructure. So that kill chain process, right? Reconnaissance and elevation, and then lateral movement throughout your Active Directory environment, those can be viewed, and this is part of that visualization and analyzation of your environment, right? So understanding what threats may be in your environment that can be used to basically push up the chain and then basically provide a threat against your Office 365 service. Fifth, since you've implemented, looking at these tasks, again, if you look at these tasks, they're not in a specific order because it depends on, again, what licensing you have. And you might also have other services, security services, that already meet some of these items, right? But the benefit of looking at the Microsoft security services as a whole is looking at that really deep level of integration that Microsoft has with all these security services. So when you look at these things like Office 365 ATP and Azure ATP, once you have these configured, you can funnel them into what's called Microsoft Threat Protection. Again, this is part of the E5 licensing plan. It brings all those alerts for all those advanced threat protection services into one cohesive dashboard. It's that single pane of glass, right? Being able to see everything that's happening within your Office 365 environment, and maybe even other integrations, depending on what you set up once you start looking at Microsoft Cloud App Security, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's another task item that's suggested a little bit later. But once you look at having these advanced threat protection services, you can basically roll them up into one dashboard called Microsoft Threat Protection. It's very easy to see. If we get some time at the end, I'll maybe show a little example of what you see from the dashboard. Number 6, we want to look at configuring, again, each one of these steps works in conjunction with what we talked about with Zero Trust. So this is the device protection, right? Looking at protecting devices and also protecting data. So you're going to look at setting up mobile app protection for your mobile devices that connect to your service. So, tablets and phones and things like that are connecting to your service. You can set up, even if people are bringing their own devices, right? You can protect your data and you protect the access to your Office 365 environment. What this means is, like, if you create an app protection policy within Intune, you can say that Microsoft 365 services are protected from basically taking data and moving it to non-corporate applications. So if you set up Outlook and Word and Teams and PowerPoint and all those products or applications into a protection policy, basically you can't cut and paste, or you can't download files or things to your device. Depending on how you set up these app protections, you can protect your corporate data from being leaked into other personal applications. Say someone was trying to download from OneDrive for Business and put it in their personal OneDrive, or put it in Box or some other cloud application. So this protects your data and your environment from those types of leakages. Next, we talk about step number 7 is looking, you protected your user base, right? Your identities, your corporate users with MFA. Now, when you've invited other, say partners or other companies that you work with, or single guest accounts and things like that into your environment, you want to protect them too. You want to protect access to your environment with their identities. So what's built into Microsoft Service is that when you have some of these plans with E3 and E5, so you have Azure Active Directory Premium 1 or Premium 2 licensing, you get what's called a 5-to-1 ratio of licensing protecting guest accounts. What that means is for every license that you have of a corporate user that's using an Azure Active Directory, say P1 plan, you can have up to 5 guest accounts that get those same protections. You have to configure them, and that's what we're talking about here, but you can protect them with like MFA. So you can set up Azure MFA even for your guest accounts that are connecting to your service to protect those guest accesses into your Office 365 service. Even more advanced is if you go to E5 plan, that Azure Identity Protection, which protects using, again, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and also signaling from Azure to protect your identities. It goes out to the dark web and looks at, if certain credentials have been leaked, things like that. You can implement what's called risk-based MFA. As you set up these policies for user risk or user sign-on risk with Azure Identity Protection, you can also set up conditional access policies that enforce like MFA depending on the risk level of the account that's accessing, or you can use the protections against that that MFA. Excuse me, sorry. You can create new conditional access rules to always require MFA, or you can also put in policies that if you think you have user identity or user compromise, user account compromise, you can have them reset their password. So these are all things that you can enable with these advanced services for identity. Also, including app protection policies. So because you put up these Intune app protections in step 5, you basically want to exclude those because they may not have the same protections for their mobile devices. So you can exclude those from the environment. Number 8, again, another device point, you're looking at the actual PCs. So you want to protect the PCs that are accessing your environment. So you want to take and enable device management. Excuse me. So you want to enroll all your workforce's devices into being protected and having compliance policies. What that really means in Windows 10 is that using Windows 10 devices, you can set up policies that say your device is compliant because you have the right antivirus, or if you enable Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, you can basically say that unless these things are set up on the device and you're compliant, you can't access the service. So you set up these device compliance policies, then you also set up requirements for these compliant PCs. So conditional access rules to say that, yes, your device can connect based upon, following through these device compliance gates. So having antivirus, having Defender ATP, your device is healthy, doesn't have any malware on it, things like that. Number 9, this is a really important one, and this is what to think about when, and Trevor is probably going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, but this is that whole point that I was saying earlier about getting rid of the 4 walls network infrastructure, using your corporate trusted network as your boundary, your network, your security boundary. So forcing people that are now remote, right? Most people are remote and connecting through to the cloud services, forcing them, say, to come VPN into your trusted network and then go back out, what's called hairpinning, right? Or as I call boomeranging. So basically coming into your corporate network through, like, say, a VPN, and then having to go back out to Office 365 services. What that really impacts is the performance in your end user's experience, right? So when you start to integrate all these, you know, points paths of network and forcing more network traffic through your environment, you're going to increase the negative performance that you see out there. So that impacts your end user's experience, what they experience, and looking at, connecting to the service. So especially when you talk about teams, which again, like I said, later on, Trevor will talk about, but the performance of voice and connections like this will be greatly impacted when you keep them going through your network and having to go through, like, say, your network security stack, like proxies or firewalls. So basically shifting that away and moving to protecting the service by taking all these other components, like protecting identity, protecting your devices, protecting your applications at the endpoint, then you have those same protections that you have for going through your networking security stack, but you've moved them to the service. And then you don't have that requirement of users having to come through your network and to connect to the services in Office 365. Another benefit there, or thinking about, is there's a service from Microsoft called Azure Active Directory Application Proxy. So even though users, you may say, oh, users still have to connect to on-prem because they have to get to certain applications on-prem. If you have that, you can, which most customers are going to have some applications that are line of business applications maybe that users have to connect to. Azure Active Directory Application Proxy is a lightweight agent-based solution where basically a small piece of software is put onto your infrastructure, onto your on-prem infrastructure, and allows those people that have authenticated to Azure Active Directory to directly access applications in your on-prem infrastructure without them having to come through VPN. And how that really works is that that small agent goes and talks to Office 365 Azure AD and says, do you have some connection for me to make for a user? So you're not opening up your firewall inbound to this agent. The agent is going and talking out to the service and saying, do you have someone that wants to connect to an application on-prem? And you can basically, it's the conduit for that user to be able to connect to your application without using a VPN to connect to your on-prem infrastructure. So it's really a benefit to help alleviate some of that traffic that you might have going through your on-prem network. Lets users go directly, and the user experience is more seamless. Since they've already connected to Office 365 and to their Azure Active Directory account, they're already authenticated. So you don't have to have them connect the VPN and authenticate again to your infrastructure to get to some of those applications. Number 10, this was, alluded to before, talking about the ACM, the adoption and change management. It's really important when you start talking about security and all these additional, pieces with security, is to think about how are you going to make the usage of these features and these functions without bogging down how users are using the service, right? So when you start looking at implementing something like multi-factor authentication, how do you get people using the service without stumbling through those processes, right? And Microsoft has lots of resources. I think one of these was alluded to earlier in the adoption change management. Microsoft has learning pathway sites, so you can create customized training for your end users using resources that Microsoft's already provided. Also, another training point that wasn't really touched on before was training your administrators, right? A lot of customers, we talked about this a little bit before in the comments, but a lot of people are saying, oh, locking down things like Teams to it not being useful. And a lot of the times, the reason that happens is that customers don't understand, or the security team doesn't understand, what are the benefits or what are the things that you can do to protect the service without doing this complete lockdown and taking out some of the features and benefits of rolling out those services, right? So it's getting the administration or the security teams up to, understanding what can you do to protect the service without total lockdown of the service, right? It's that usability versus security, balance. So it's Microsoft has a lot of learning modules for administrators to be able to go through. And then again, one of the biggest ones is the multi-factor authentication, being able to give that information out to your users so they're not blocked from the service, right? When you start rolling those things out, it's really educating them on how to, register for MFA and protect their accounts, but not block them from using the service. So it's really making sure that you have all those training plans, all those training information out there to be able to provide a smooth rollout to the users. Number 11, getting started with Microsoft Cloud App Security. And I don't know how many people have used Cloud Access Security Broker, what those are. This is Microsoft's version of a Cloud App Security Broker. What it is a solution that offers blocking and discovery of shadow IT applications. So as your users have gone remote, right, if they have these blockers from doing their work because they're remote or because they don't know how to use certain services, they start looking at these other, cloud services, like say storage services like Box or Dropbox or things like that. How do you know when these people are using those services and putting your corporate data and putting you at risk, right? How do you know that they're using these services? So looking at Microsoft Cloud App Security, since you have the full version of Microsoft Cloud App Security comes with E5, with Microsoft 365 E5, you'll also have licensing for Defender Advanced Threat Protection. That's the endpoint protection service from Microsoft for Windows 10. It's actually built into Windows 10. You just enable it if you have the licensing. That will provide signals to Cloud App Security for discovery. So as users use the internet and go out to services, it will send that information over to Cloud App Security, and you can put in policies that say, like, if people are connecting to a service like Box, for instance, they can't upload certain documents up there. Like, say, if they're not labeled with something like Azure Information Protection, they can't upload them to Box because that would be a data leakage point for your environment, for your corporate data. So what Cloud App Security does is protect you against data leakage and your corporate data leakage out to these other cloud services. So we'll discover and protect. So you can put in policies to do things like blocking documents or blocking messages, depending on the type of application. For instance, if you're using something like Slack as a service in the cloud, it can block certain messages from being sent in the service. And those are called user session policies within Microsoft Cloud App Security. So you can do a lot of discovery and protection against shadow IT apps in your environment. And last, what we want to look at is monitoring for threats and taking action, right? So one of the big points or places that you can, if you have the licensing, is the Microsoft Threat Protection Dashboard. If you don't have the licensing for that, you can go and still use what's called the Microsoft 365 Security Center. And what that is, that's the dashboard, all-up dashboard for the services that you are licensed for. So if you go to security.microsoft.com with your account, you'll be able to see Security Center. And in there, what's a very important item, and again, these tasks aren't in specific order, and it all depends on what services you already may have. But Secure Score is a very important service that Microsoft puts out there. And what it really is a list based on what services you have in your Office 365 environment or Microsoft 365 environment, and gives you kind of prescriptive, specific items. Like number one, we've already went over this, but enabling multi-factor authentication for at least your administrator accounts. That would be a number one priority item for identity. And what's nice within SecureScore is it breaks down these tasks for security into the 4 or 5 different pillars of kind of zero trust, right? So the identity, data, device categories. So basically gives you information about what you're licensed for and what you can enable based upon that. And also the other benefit in SecureScore into that SecureScore is it does a comparison and gives you kind of a score against others within your industry, depending on what you set your industry and your tenant for. So basically gives you a kind of a comparative score against what you could be doing versus what others are doing, not specific by task, but like a level of security based upon your score. So it's a little bit of gamification of increasing your score and increasing the security of your environment looking at that score. So let me stop and let me share. Just wanted to share. So if Joel, can you guys see this?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So this is Security
Yes, we
Center.
can see it.
And so this is sorry, I lied. This is Security Center. So this is security.microsoft.com. I've gotten here based on going through from the Office 365 tenant environment. So basically it gives you an overview, right? This is just a test tenant. So you'll notice that it's got a 18% score, right? And it'll go through and give you kind of where you are against the entirety based upon what's been implemented in your environment. For instance, as I said, category breakdowns based on those zero trust pillars, right? So when you look at identity, data, device, apps, and infrastructure, you can see kind of where your scoring is, how good you're doing based upon the total here. So like identity, there's lots of improvement we can make with identity, for instance. So you can enable MFA for administrators. If you look at this this list to the right, you can start seeing some of the things that will impact your score. So requiring MFA for administrators, administrative roles, that would be one that can raise your score. So it'll actually give you the directions and everything that can implement these things. And it'll also give you some prerequisites around what licensing you need. Like this is included with Azure Active Directory Free, which is included with all versions of Office 365. So it'll give you that page to go to, the information, and how to set these up. So it's very, very prescriptive, can give you lots of information about things that can increase the security and your security posture in total for your Office 365 tenant environment. So things like turning on sign-in risk policy. Since this is an E5 tenant, we have the Azure Identity Protection. So you can turn on sign-in risk or user risk. And again, those are things like user risk is compromised identities, like looking at the risk of a user account, the service going out and looking at things like the dark web and seeing that your credentials have been compromised and put out on the dark web, things like that. In the background, Microsoft is doing all these, back-end signaling and data collection and analysis to provide more protection against your service. Okay, so I wanted to get to any questions anybody may have.
There was one question that came in talking about, does the Intune mobile app protection block copying from Teams or taking screenshots?
It can block screenshots. I'd have to take it back. The Teams, exactly. There's different policies, and Microsoft's changing, kind of the and what's included in terms of applications that can be protected specifically. But if you're protecting things like SharePoint, for instance, at the bottom end in your app policy, then that's still the back end point of the Teams infrastructure. So you can get around some of that depending on what the service is. Were there other questions?
I haven't seen anything else come in.
So, Mark, I have one.
Yes.
So when it comes to switching from general belief of a network-based security model to zero trust, what is the aha moment you've seen with customers?
Well, I think it's the switching or the shift from that the trusted four-wall model to looking at and shifting the protection against those pillars, right? When we talked about zero trust, what you're doing is really shifting the model away from having anything trusted, because as we know, kind of from a security realm standpoint nowadays, you see a lot of these environments getting breached, right? So you have security being breached in your trust environment. Say someone's credentials are stolen, or some partner integration into your Active Directory has, for instance, like Target, right? That breach was through a partner integration into their Active Directory. So then elevating those, that break protection into the environment, they elevated themselves into administrative privilege on the on-prem environment. That's because their network, their Active Directory infrastructure was a trusted model, right? They figured that their on-prem infrastructure is trusted, so they don't put protections within that environment directly. So it's thinking about how to shift away from that trusted network and putting the layers of protection against the service in general, right? The apps, the identity, the data, and the devices, and continually protecting based upon the changes to those to that environment. So say a device falls out of policy, say, a Windows 10 machine, you have it set up to connect to Office 365, and generally it's been scanning and protecting, but then for some reason antivirus or the Defender ATP service goes down on it, or the antivirus doesn't scan within a certain time frame. You're protecting against that because that device is now less health. If you put in those policies, right, with devices to protect against your service, you've now negated that machine. You can see that information, seeing that they didn't fit the policy and they couldn't connect, or they couldn't do certain things because of the degradation of their device. You can reach out and connect to that user and connect to the device and help remediate it, or you can put in automated policies to help remediate that device health. So it's really switching the services and the protection instead of from your protected corporate network to the service. So enabling those service integrations. And one thing I do want to say too, which is a big benefit when you talk about the Microsoft security services in general against Office 365, is there's a high amount of integration. That's the real benefit when you start looking at these things, is that the services are highly integrated within Office 365 and the services that are being provided. Because if you look at third-party services, for instance, if there's a popular cloud access security broker out there that I worked with one customer, And the problem they had is they had to send all their email as connection from Exchange Online to that service for it to evaluate and analyze the data, and then send that data back to Office 365 Exchange Online. So it's another hop out to another, protected, security service, to this cloud access security broker, to look at the email, and had to be sent there and back. Whereas the integration with, say, Microsoft Cloud App Security, that integration is built in. When you enable the connector from Microsoft Cloud App Security into your Office 365 and Exchange Online, that integration is just a button click. You don't have to send a connector over to send email, say, to the service and back. It's basically connection directly into the service. So it's a high integration point. You don't have the extra management or complexity or places, truthfully, that can break down, right? So like, say that connector broke down sending data to that other cloud app security broker, you would have a problem within your environment. The email may not make it back, or you may be unprotected in that situation. So it's looking at these services from Microsoft and understanding the value that's there, and especially when you look at the licensing that you have, right? So there's lots of customers that I come to, and they have certain licenses, and they have certain security services that are included with their license, but they may not be looking at it because they say, well, they already have a third-party solution. Well, of course, when you start looking at it, right, and comparing that and saying, like, you could save money, say, on this third-party security service if you already have it licensed. Or again, it might be a higher integration with Office 365 or Microsoft security services you're trying to protect with that third-party service. Why not evaluate and look at the Microsoft services?
Gotcha. And one of our attendees, Leanne, had a similar question about making IT organizations more comfortable with the tooling. If you could give them just like 3 tips or 3 starting points, technology-wise, where would you start? Would it be like conditional access, or, CASB stuff, or even like app proxy? What do you think?
So again, baselining certain things is looking at your identity, right? That's the foundational building block. So looking at things like MFA, Azure Identity Protection, those type of things, and even integrating. One thing we didn't talk about is a security point, but lots of customers may be federating, like, and what that means is integrating other cloud services. For instance, maybe Box is a solution that's vetted for a certain department within your organization. Connecting that service to Azure AD, to that identity infrastructure, basically what's called federation, will provide protection against that application for authentication, so that you can basically go out to, use your same identity. It's single sign-on plus the, using your one set of credentials, instead of having to maintain like credentials within your Azure Active Directory for certain applications, and then saying like I said, like Box, having your own credentials there. You can integrate that all together into the one Azure Active Directory platform. But again, looking at the basic building blocks of identity, again, the other point is things like cloud app security is really something to really look at, because you do want to start looking at what are users using in your environment, right? As they shift remote, again, the idea that they're going to go and find different tools or different, the least pain point process of getting their work done. So they may be using non-sanctioned applications out on the internet, shadow IT applications that you have to start being able to visualize and understand that those people are using, so you can put in policies saying, or you can even, like, you can see that they're using these applications, and then go and talk to them and say, these are not sanctioned applications, or you can specifically block them. Especially, like I said, if you have Microsoft Defender, Advanced Threat Protection, and Cloud App Security together, that's a high integration point. There's very powerful things you can do with that integration with those two services, because you're sending signal data, what people are doing on their end Windows 10 machine, no matter where they are at. So wherever they're at home or anywhere, that information's being sent to Cloud App Security, and you can put in policies to block or allow certain things to happen within that environment. So depending on what your corporate policy are and reviewing that data, that's that whole, again, visibility and analysis of what's going on. Because a lot of information out there right now for a lot of customers is a black box, right? They're trying to do it with the tools that they already have, right? That network security tools like proxies, right? But there's so much data that's coming through those proxies that you can't pinpoint what they're actively going out to. How do you analyze that data? That's what Cloud App Security can do. It can analyze what people are going out and using, and especially with that integration with Defender Advanced Threat Protection. So those are a couple of things. But again, it's looking at all those services, right? What's available to you, maybe even having what we do. We have a service offering where we come out and evaluate what you have from a security standpoint, and also look at mapping that the security tools you may already have, and what could be an equivalent tool from Microsoft, from these security services, and understand what may be a good path to look at that higher level of integration or higher level of protection. Because looking at the services you may already have, those third party and some of the Microsoft services, security service you may already have versus what you could have. And again, one of the big things, understanding from kind of historically, Microsoft has not been considered the highest security company out there. But in the last 2-3 years, if you look at a lot of the reviews and information out there, Microsoft has significantly increased the security capabilities of their tool sets. And if you look at like a lot of Gartner Magic Quadrant and things like that, Microsoft is now in that upper right quadrant for a lot of these services. So like Defender ATP is up there, and Microsoft Cloud App Security is up there, Azure AD is up there. So looking and taking a better look versus just thinking that the historical information or the historical, like, oh, Microsoft's not great at security kind of concept, is rethinking that and reevaluating that, because Microsoft has done a great job in the last 3-4 years with increasing their security services and offerings and increasing the ability and integration of those services.
That's really helpful. Thanks, man.
Yep.